Last week, I mentioned that it was possible to misinterpret Ehrman by listening to some of his material and coming away that he was implying we cannot know the original wording of the New Testament. Here's another example.
If anybody wanted a copy of this Gospel of Mark, they had to make a copy by hand, and so they did so. But invariably, they made a mistake or 2 or 3 or 20. When someone came along who wanted a copy of that copy, they copied the copy and they replicated the mistakes that the first copyist made. And they made their own mistakes. And then when a third person came along to copy the copy of the copy, they replicated the mistakes of both of their predecessors and made mistakes of their own.
When he says this devoid of fuller context, it could be interpreted that he implies deep skepticism of the original wording of the New Testament due to the evolution of the text from scribal error. Believe it or not, this is not Ehrman's position. But it could also be the case that these scholars are blending this first notion of an implied meaning with something Ehrman does believe. The second concept is the idea that there were multiple versions of the gospel, even amongst the gospel authors themselves. This idea is called the Bauer hypothesis, and indeed, Ehrman embraces this theory, as one can see from Lost Christianities, published in 2003. We see Ehrman advocating for this view in Misquoting Jesus when he argues that scribes likely made changes in the manuscript tradition for theological reasons. Sometimes we see critics of Ehrman mixing these concepts, as when Nick Perrin writes, Ehrman imagines a reconstruction in which the words of Jesus, while making their long journey from the first century until now, have been subject to all kinds of revision. Such revision comes in the first instance from the earliest community, then from the gospel writers, then from the scribes, then from the translators. The extent of the revision has been massive. For all intents and purposes, Jesus' words have been lost in transmission. So, here we have the Bauer hypothesis about the theological evolution of Orthodox Christianity, and we have the statements from Ehrman which, taken by themselves, could imply, but don't, that we are unable to have epistemic access to the original wording of the New Testament. I think either the possible implied meaning of the scribal process, or that, plus the Bauer hypothesis, are what lead scholars to their mistaken views about Ehrman. These are two distinct ideas of which there is no necessary causal relationship. Consider these 4 logical possibilities. Number 1, accept deep skepticism of the original wording because of scribal error and accept the Bauer hypothesis. Number 2, accept deep skepticism of the original wording because of scribal error and reject the Bauer hypothesis. Number 3, reject deep skepticism of the original wording and accept the Bauer hypothesis. Or 4, reject deep skepticism and reject the Bauer hypothesis. This third option, that's Ehrman's view, not this first one. In Misquoting Jesus, Ehrman writes, the best we can do is get back to an early stage of its transmission and simply hope that what we construct about the copies made at that stage reasonably reflects what Paul himself actually wrote, or at least what he intended to write when he dictated the letter. Note here that Ehrman says reasonably reflects. Reasonably reflects. So he does believe we can get access to the original wording of the New Testament. Of course, this leaves us with the question, why would Ehrman even say we don't have the copies of the copies of the copies of the originals when he knows we could faithfully, reliably reconstruct the original? 2 points here. First, sometimes Ehrman equivocates on the word no. This is another plausible reason why some scholars don't fully understand Ehrman's view. In some cases, he uses that term with the sense of 100% certainty.
There are places where we don't know what the authors of the New Testament originally wrote.
And in other cases, he uses the term with a less than 100% certainty, but clearly indicates epistemic confidence.
There are other kinds of mistakes. Now, I don't know for sure that scribes are trying to change the text. I don't have any scribes around to interrogate about the matter. But there are some changes that don't look like they could possibly simply be a slip of the pen.
Given this remark, Ehrman indicates a type of knowledge, dare I say, certainty, about some cases where a scribe makes an intentional addition. Knowledge is on a spectrum. Some things we can be extremely certain about, other things somewhat certain about, some things not as certain, and even other things no certainty at all. For the keen ear, we can hear Ehrman make these epistemic distinctions in his presentations, and we see it in his writings. Second, His statements about the manuscript data are not only factually correct, but also delivered with a rhetorical flair for pedagogical purposes. Misquoting Jesus is written for people who know nothing about textual criticism, but who might like to learn something about how scribes were changing scripture and about how we can recognize where they did so. Ehrman is teaching the audience a lesson. We have good reason to believe that in most of these cases, the audience is just like the young Bart Ehrman, who doesn't even know what textual criticism is. They probably don't even know there are variants in the manuscript tradition. And Ehrman wants to open their eyes to the world they are woefully ignorant about. He is a good orator, and like many good public speakers, he frequently uses his good material because of how successful it has been.
How many of you are here to see me get creamed?
All of us, when we've followed some thinker or speaker for some time, see how they use the same material that has been successful with audiences. Now, let's take a look at one example from Ehrman's book. In Misquoting Jesus chapter 3, Ehrman was looking at various texts of the New Testament. One such text was John Mill's 1707 apparatus, which included variant manuscript readings. This text caused some controversy because now the status of the original text was thrown wide open in dispute. If one did not know which words were original in the Greek New Testament, how could one use these words in deciding correct Christian doctrine and teaching? Here, we see both of these points. We see Ehrman using one type of knowing, and we also see a rhetorical question. Ehrman likes to ask rhetorical questions, not necessarily to bring deep skepticism into people's lives, but to get them thinking about the issue. It's a rhetorical device, and as much as some people may not like it, it's perfectly acceptable. I want to give props to Dan Wallace, a New Testament scholar at Dallas Theological Seminary. I read Wallace's 2006 review of Ehrman's book and found it pretty darn good. Wallace understands that there is nuance in Ehrman's position. Although Ehrman does not quite say this, he leaves the impression that the original form of the New Testament was rather different from what the manuscripts now read. And instead of saying that Ehrman does not differentiate between quantity and quality of manuscripts, Wallace makes a more modest claim. Ehrman overplays the quality of the variants while underscoring their quantity. One would think Ehrman would want to have his discussion nuanced a bit more. And finally, the impression Ehrman sometimes gives throughout the book is that of wholesale uncertainty about the original wording, a view that is far more radical than the one he actually embraces. You see here that Wallace understands and sees this distinction between Ehrman's actual beliefs and the way Ehrman could be interpreted. Wallace's analysis is far closer to an accurate understanding of Ehrman's views than those we looked at last week. Now let me close with a word about making a fair description. It is unfair to our intellectual opponents if we inaccurately convey what their positions are. Sometimes we may be guilty of simply misunderstanding our opponents. This happens a lot, and it happens to the best of us. However, in some cases, there are instances where Christian apologists have not provided the nuances that Ehrman explicitly provides. Could he have made nuances more frequently? Sure. But he still does. And to not mention those nuances when communicating his beliefs does a disservice to his writing and portrays a straw man. Some scholars have botched Ehrman's positions because they've taken some of his remarks out of context and misunderstand Ehrman's pedagogical purposes. As we have seen, Ehrman does distinguish between the quality of the manuscripts, and he does believe we can have access to the original wording of the New Testament.
The question is whether we can reconstruct the originals that have been lost. Can we reconstruct them or not? For many years, I thought that the answer was yes. That's going to be Dan's answer. But scholarship changed, and it became widely thought among scholars that we cannot reconstruct the original, and that it does not even make sense to talk about the originals. I started to understand why, and now I'm convinced.